Okay. Well, good afternoon to some of you. Good morning to others. My name is Matt Pickering. I am the Endorsement and Maintenance Task Lead here at Patel. And we want to welcome you all to this other webinar that we're having, other educational informational webinar we're having for the endorsement and maintenance work. Specifically, this webinar is to provide an overview of the endorsement maintenance meeting procedures. So we do have fall 2023 meetings that are starting off at the end of this month for endorsement of measures that were submitted to the fall 2023 cycle. Those meetings continue on to the first week of February, and we wanted to at least provide an overview of how measures will be reviewed during those meetings and what stakeholders can expect. And so when do developers have an opportunity to participate and answer any questions, how discussions will proceed, and ultimately how voting or when voting will take place during the meetings as well. So as always with our other webinars, we kindly request that you try to use the Q&A function to submit any questions you may have. And then at the end of the meeting, we will also be answering questions as we can until we are able to get to the end of our time today. So as we go through, please feel free to use that Q&A function to submit those questions accordingly. And going to the next slide. Again, we just want to welcome everyone. I know that we have a good number of folks joining us today. This meeting will be recorded and that information will be provided about a week onto the event page. So if you go onto our PQM website under the calendar and find today's meeting on that calendar, you'll find the slides there. So the slides are there as a PDF, and then the recording from today will also be provided, like I said, within 1 week after. But again, welcome to everyone on the call. Joining us today, if we go to the next slide, in addition to myself, we have a few other presenters. We have Brenna Rabel, who's our technical director. So she will be also presenting parts of our meeting today. I mentioned myself. We also have Jessica Ortiz. She's joining us as well as our social scientist to present some aspect of our presentation today. And then on the call, we'll have Jeff Geppert, who may be able to answer any questions as needed. He is our senior research leader as well. So here are our presenters as well today. If we go to the next slide. So like I mentioned, this presentation is really an overview of the endorsement and maintenance meeting proceedings. And we just wanted to provide sort of a reminder of the various steps in this process of endorsement. Again, this is the fall 2023 cycle kicked off the new endorsement and maintenance process. And we really thank the developers who have been engaging with us through this initial phase, initial cycle. But there are 6 steps listed here. So we completed the intent to submit for fall 2023. We completed the full measure submission, and we also are now going into we finished public commenting and the staff internal review, and we're now going into the committee independent review and the endorsement decision meetings. And thus it'll close with an appeals period. So to break that out even further, if we go to the next slide, we're really focusing on these 2 areas, as you can see on the far right, the E&M committee review and the endorsement decision being posted after the endorsement meeting. So right now, the 5 endorsement and maintenance project committees are reviewing measures, and each individual on those committees is asked to do it independently. So they're doing this based on the measure submission and applying that to applying the PQM rubric to those measures and entering in their evaluations. And they're actually rating the various different domains of the rubric, so importance, scientific acceptability, feasibility, et cetera. They're providing a rating of met, not met but addressable, or not met, and providing some rationale as well associated with those ratings. All of that is available online and free for the public to view, as well as developers. And it's in real time. So as committee members are submitting their independent reviews, it is popping up on those respective measure pages at the very bottom of the page. So we will be collecting all of that information towards the end of the month, and then aggregating that and using that as a basis of discussion during these endorsement meetings. So as we mentioned previously, and also within our guidebook and previous webinars, we will be looking at the aggregated rating results. So of those measures that looked at or of those measures, the importance domain, how many of those committee members rated it as met, how many as not met, and using that to find where there's areas of non-consensus to really focus in some the discussion of those measures. And we'll get into that in a little bit. There's also consensus that can happen as well. And we're not ignoring those measures at all. Those measures that have consensus all the way through those domains, whether it be all met or not met or a mixture of those, we won't be ignoring those. We will have time to discuss those as well, and you'll see that through the meeting proceedings. So it's not like we're just only talking about the measures that did not get consensus. We will be looking at the measures that also had consensus through those independent ratings and really discussing some things with the committee. So after we do those discussions, there will be a vote, and we will then post that vote as well and post that endorsement decision. So again, there's no post-comment meetings. There aren't any CSAC meetings, which was from the prior CBE process. Instead, the endorsement decisions reside at the standing committee level. So when we have a vote, that is the endorsement decision you're voting on. During these meetings, we are not voting on every criterion or every domain of the rubric. We are only doing one vote, which is an endorsement vote, and really discussing some of the issues, as I mentioned, based on what we find through the committee independent reviews. Okay, and let's go to the next slide. So teeing all that up, that's exactly what we're going to be doing for today, is really talking about those endorsement and meeting procedures, including the roles of both the advisory and recommendation groups and the co-chairs. So we also have co-chairs for these committees. We talk a little bit of high level of their roles, as well as the voting procedures, any public comment opportunities as well. So we will have public comment opportunities built in throughout the evaluation of these measures, and then the expectations of subject matter experts as well as measure developers and stewards. So for the agenda today, we'll first go through this overview of the endorsement meeting objectives, agenda, and the Zoom platform. So when we're going through these objectives, these are the objectives for the endorsement meeting. So just teeing that up for everyone in advance. Then we'll also review what the roll call would look like, as well as disclosure of interest and quorum procedures, and then an overview of the evaluation procedures themselves, the voting and participant roles, and then we'll have time for questions, like I mentioned before we adjourn. Again, if you do have questions as we're going through these slides, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your application here. You can see there's a Q&A function where you can actually enter in your question, and then we will see if we can address that either through direct messaging to you or live at the very end of the call. Okay, so next I'll turn it over to my colleague Jessica, who will proceed with some of our initial discussions. Jessica.
Thank you, Matt. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jessica Ortiz. I support the endorsement and maintenance work, and I'll be going over just some of the endorsement meeting objectives, the agenda that we use for the endorsement meetings, and some information about the Zoom platform that we use to host the meetings. So next slide, please. So the purpose of the endorsement meetings is really threefold. So during each project committee endorsement meeting, we'll review and discuss the measures submitted to that project for the given cycle. We also review public comments received for those measures, and then render endorsement decisions for those measures. Next slide. And then these are some housekeeping reminders for the recommendations group. So the recommendations group will be primarily participating in the discussion. As you can see, we have a little note at the bottom of the slide, just noting that the advisory group members will be listening to the discussion and then casting their votes after that's over. So for the recommendations group, the system, so the Zoom platform, will allow you to mute and unmute yourself and turn your camera on or off throughout the meeting. And then we just ask for committee members to raise your hand and unmute yourself when you're called on, and then lower your hand again after you're done with your comment. We ask that you state your first and last name if you're calling in, and then just encouraging face-to-face discussion. We ask that you keep your video on throughout the event, especially if you're talking. And this is, again, mostly for the recommendations group. Feel free to use the chat feature to communicate with the Battelle staff. And then the last one is really for everyone on the call. So if you're experiencing any technical issues, feel free to contact the project team, and then we provide our email, so pqmsupport@battelle.org for technical issues. Next slide. And this is a little bit about the Zoom platform that we use for the endorsement meeting. So this is a screenshot of the desktop version of the platform. You can see the attendees on the left, and then sort of the chat feature on the right-hand side. There are some useful buttons that you'll be using throughout the meeting. So the bottom left-hand buttons where you see the number 1 is where you can mute or unmute yourself and then turn your camera on and off. The middle buttons where the number 2 is, that's where you can access the chat. And then the third set of buttons there, where the reaction tab is, that's where you can raise and lower your hand. Next slide. So this is just the phone view or mobile view of the same platform. So you have the same functions, just looks a little bit different. You're able to unmute and mute yourself on the bottom left-hand corner, and then you're able to click the participants button to see who is on the call, where the number 2 is, and then where the 3A button is, you can open the chat, and then within that same sort of panel of buttons, you can raise or lower your hand, and then there's some reactions buttons there too. Next slide. Thank you. And so these are some ground rules that we remind the group of before the discussion starts. We ask that everyone be prepared and come to the meeting already having reviewed the materials. We ask that everyone's voice be respected, and for everyone to remain engaged and actively participate. We have, so based on your evaluation and recommendations, your comments should really be based on these, and the participation should be around the measure evaluation and the rubric. We ask that you keep your comments concise and focused, be respectful, and allow others to, chime in, and then share your experiences and learn from others. Next slide. And so this is a sample of an agenda that we'll be using for the endorsement meetings. And we'll start out with a brief welcome and review of the meeting objectives, and then we'll have the committee roll call and the opportunity for committee members to disclose any conflicts of interest. And after that, we'll go into the evaluation, give an overview of the evaluation procedures and measures that are being considered for endorsement. After that, we will have the test vote. So this is where committee members can practice submitting their votes, and the team can just confirm that these votes are being received. This is also sort of where we do a second quorum check to make sure that everyone who is voting can submit their vote. And then after this comes the actual evaluation of the measures submitted for the project. And for this section, we are actually discussing the measures where consensus was not reached first, and then we will review the consensus measures. After this, we'll have Additional discussion on the measure recommendations if time permits. So we'll see if the committee has any further recommendations or suggestions for the developer regarding the measures discussed. After this, we'll have an opportunity for public comment. And after that, we will have some next steps for the committee and then adjourn. So I will turn it over to Brenna, who will discuss a little bit more about the roll call and disclosures of interest and quorum.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks, Matt, for the intro earlier. For those that missed it, I am Brenna Rabel. I'm the technical director for Battelle's PQM activities, which of course includes the endorsement and maintenance process. So I'm just going to take a few minutes here just to kind of walk you through what it's going to feel like on the day as we go through roll call, as we ask for your disclosures of interest, and then also give you information that I hope will be helpful in advance about how we're establishing quorum. But also you'll know we're going to review all of that on the day of as well. So it's okay if none of this gets memorized between now and then. So we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so meeting quorum requires that 60% of the recommendations group members are present during roll call at the beginning of the meeting. So this is super important. This is the number that we have to hit if we just to allow us to even have the discussion that we're here to have. So if you start getting a lot of reminder emails in advance of the meetings, this is why we want to ensure that if you're on the recommendations group, which is to say you're on the group that is designated to have these conversations, that you're there when we start the day. And then the endorsement decisions are going to be rendered via votes after each of these recommendations group discussions. So so there's the discussion quorum, which is the percentage of the recommendations group that actually needs to be on the line to even have the discussion. And then there's the voting quorum, which is that we need at least 80% of active committee members. So that includes recommendation group and advisory group members who haven't been recused for that measure to be present when we render those voting decisions. So it's just a higher threshold overall to make sure that the vote that we get is largely representative of the group's overall opinions and consensus. Next slide, please. So obviously this isn't how it's going to look on the day, but at the beginning of the meeting when we do our roll call, this is how it's going to look for you. So you're going to have the list of the recommendation group members and the advisory group members. You're going to have your name and credentials listed on the slide, and then a member of the Battelle team is basically going to go down the line, name by name, and ask you to just declare that you're there with your name, your affiliation, and then whether or not you have anything to disclose. And that includes anything that you put on your initial disclosures form when you nominated to become a member of the committee, and anything that's come up since then. And then we'll make determinations in real time about whether or not you need to recuse yourself from any of the votes at that point. Next slide, please. So there is also the possibility that some of the committee meetings will involve some subject matter experts. Now, this is something that is detailed in our guidebook and that we've talked about in past webinars. But as you all know, we've really consolidated the number of overall committees that are being convened for endorsement and maintenance throughout this process. So rather than having, sort of condition or treatment specific committees, we now have these more general committees that kind of follow like the patient journey, right? And one of the things that we heard a lot in public comment is that there was, some worry that subject matter expertise might get lost. So we reserve the right to bring in subject matter experts who are non-voting participants, who can provide any relevant context to the committee's measure, endorsement, review, and discussion. So just making sure that we don't lose, if we have a very specific measure that's in a sort of a clinical area that maybe isn't already represented on the committee, we may bring in these subject matter experts. So after we've done our initial roll call and disclosures, we'll then also bring up any subject matter experts that are on the line. So you'll see it by topic area, first and last name and credentials, and we'll just take roll there too. So everybody's aware of who's on the line. Okay, next slide, please. So now I'm just going to walk us through the actual evaluation procedures. And again, you'll get all of this information on the day as well. just so that we all level set, we all know exactly what it is that you're being asked to do during the discussion, and just so that you kind of have a good understanding of sort of where you fit into the overall consensus building process here. So let me jump to the next slide. So I'm hoping this isn't the first time that you've all seen this, but if it is, no worries. So you'll see across the top here, these are the 5 committees that we're convening for the E&M process this year. So if you are on an E&M committee, you've been assigned to one of these. So we've got primary prevention, initial recognition and management of acute events, chronic disease, surgery, and behavioral health, and then end-of-life care, rescue, and specialized interventions, and then finally cost and efficiency. There's about 60 people in each of those committees divided between the advisory group and the recommendation group, and I'll talk about the differences between those in a moment. But what's mostly important to note here is that basically both of these groups are providing the individual preliminary reviews of the measures in advance of the endorsement meeting. The recommendations group is slated with the job of actually hashing out the discussion with the help of a Patel facilitator and co-chairs during the meeting, and then everyone from both committees is responsible for voting on the measures after those discussions. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is just a little bit more detail. I mean, again, largely the thing that you all have in common, regardless of which group you've been assigned to, is that you are asked to review and provide ratings and written recommendations on the measures prior to the recommendation group meeting. And you may be wondering why we do that, because it might feel a little bit redundant, but it's incredibly helpful when we have all of the information and your initial ratings on these measures so we can synthesize them and look at the areas where, I think Jessica kind of touched on this, areas where there's a lot of consensus already, either everybody really loves a measure, everybody has a lot of concerns with the measure. It's the ones where people are sort of on the fence or there's really strong opposing opinions, where we really need to probably delve in and have our facilitators take their time and make sure that we can try to come to some consensus about the measures, whether that means clarifying points of contention or just sort of helping folks kind of weigh benefits and burdens to get us to a decision. The advisory group in general, although you're not actively participating in the recommendations group meeting, it's still super important because it allows us to incorporate a much, much more robust group of experts into these decisions than would have been otherwise. And the reason that we have this sort of recommendations subgroup here is because we wanted to make sure that the conversations could remain productive. Sometimes, especially in a virtual setting, if too many people are involved in a discussion, it's really difficult to get a flow and to like really dig in and have some back and forth. So the recommendations group's job is basically to take all the information from those preliminary reviews, hash it out together, try to get, elucidate some more information so that everyone then has more information when it comes time to vote at the end. We can go to the next slide. So your roles and responsibilities overall, again, I hope that most of you have sort of had some exposure to this, but if not, that's why we're here today, right? So your big job is just to work with us to evaluate and endorse quality measures. You're going to be participating in all of these scheduled calls and endorsement meetings, which starts with what you're doing here today. So thank you so much for joining us. You're going to be reviewing all of these relevant endorsement and maintenance materials. So measure submission forms, information from public comment, the preliminary staff assessments that we provide to you, and all of that in advance of the endorsement meetings. You're going to conduct your independent measure reviews using the evaluation rubric that we'll provide by the established deadlines, and complete your disclosure of interest forms. Before I get into the last bullet here, I'll just mention, I know there's a learning curve, right? This is the first time that we're running this process at Battelle. There are some changes from prior cycles. So in a way, everybody, even those who are experienced with endorsement and maintenance, are doing this for the first time. So we're here. We are here to help answer questions. And I would also say not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good as you're filling out your preliminary evaluations. What's really important is that you take the time to engage with the measurement, like the measure materials, do your best to kind of understand what each measure is trying to get at, and then provide sort of gut reactions to that. And if some measures get a little bit more of your attention than others, so be it. But it's more important that you engage with the material and get what feedback you can to us than not to. And so then finally, I'll just say, we really want you to notify us, the endorsement maintenance project team, which you can just reach through that general pqm@patel.org account. If you have a change in employer or contact information, we don't want to lose you in our communication system. So we want to make sure that we're able to get in touch with you as needed. If you have a really significant prolonged conflict of interest emerge, so if you start working on a project on a measure directly related to or competing with a measure that's under review for your committee, let us know that so that we can figure out how to best proceed. If you're unable to attend a scheduled meeting, that's really important, especially if you're a recommendation group member. It helps us better understand what our quorum needs are going to be. And if we need to shift folks around between committees, then we need to do that. So please always let us know as far in advance as you can if you can't attend a scheduled meeting. And then finally, if you wish to resign or be moved to inactive status. You can see here sort of in the fine print, if a committee member has poor attendance or participation, we may ask that you resign or we may remove you from the committee. I don't want that to sound like a threat. It is not. It's really just if a person is just actively not participating in any of these activities, then we'll probably want to have a conversation with them about whether they'd like to continue. But in general, we just ask for communication and keep us posted, on your overall status and willingness to keep participating in these activities. So next slide, please. Okay, so during the meeting itself, what we're really looking for is for you to evaluate each measure against the domains of the PQM measure evaluation rubric. So you'll have that, and you'll hopefully be very, very well acquainted with it as you've already done your preliminary assessments. And what we really need you to do is just indicate the extent to which you feel that each criterion is met and provide some rationale for that rating. So you're going to be reviewing comments submitted during the public comment period, and then you're going to take all that information and render endorsement decisions for candidate measures. And here's the thing, whether a measure is endorsed or not, in our write-up afterwards, there's a lot of qualitative information that comes out of these meetings that can really help measure developers refine their measures in the future, whether they're endorsed or not. So we're really interested in all of the contours of kind of the reasoning behind your votes and why you think a measure did or did not fall short of achieving any of the criteria. So, we're really interested in your thoughts. We're really looking for a robust and productive conversation during these meetings that factors in all of these different perspectives. Okay, next slide, please. So I mentioned already that there's going to be committee co-chairs during the meetings, that they're going to be supporting Battelle staff with facilitating these meetings. So what's important to know here is there are 2 co-chairs for each committee. One will be a patient representative, the other will be a non-patient, likely a clinician, but sometimes not a clinician. All co-chairs are full voting members of the committee during their term. So first and foremost, co-chairs are members of these committees, but they have a couple of additional responsibilities. So a big one is meeting with the Battelle staff beforehand, just to really make sure they understand each of the measures that are coming up for review and sort of what their role is as a co-chair, and helping to make sure that conversations, really stay collegial and stay in scope. The other added sort of responsibility of these co-chairs is to serve on our appeals committee. The appeals committee is only convened on an ad hoc basis when appeals are requests for appeals are submitted and sort of approved, so found to have grounds. Then we would convene an appeals committee that includes co-chairs from all of the committees that we convened in that cycle, along with some Battelle staff, to hash out those decisions. So that's just another responsibility of the co-chairs. And then finally, really just assisting Battelle with anticipating questions and identifying additional information that might be useful to the committee. So from their perspectives, if there are certain measures that they think are going to be especially contentious, or if there's certain perspectives or clinical information about the measure that might not be obvious to everyone reading the materials, we would look to our co-chairs to help us make sure that information comes to light during the meeting so that we can talk it through. So with that, we can go to the next slide. And I'm actually going to transition it here to Matt to go through a little bit more about how these two co-chairs are going to work together, and then just take us through the rest of the evaluation for the meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Brenna. And again, just reminding folks, please go ahead and use this Q&A function if you have questions. It's at the bottom of the platform. It just says Q and then the ampersand A. And we can definitely take those questions in and see what we can address towards the end of the call. But as Brenna mentioned, we do have two co-chairs, and they are committee members. So we do very much appreciate the participation and engagement of these individuals for each one of the endorsement and maintenance committee meetings. But the two co-chairs have different functions. One, we have a patient representative co-chair. So this person is representing the patients and the patient representatives on the committee by really ensuring that that patient community voice is considered. So that's considered really focusing on the patients that are on the recommendations group and some of the concerns that they may have, but also from the advisory group. So a lot of that independent review that is done prior to these endorsement meetings, kind of pulling out some of the key points or key issues or concerns that maybe some of the patients have from the advisory group. Now, the non-patient representative co-chair is really helping to ensure that we also make sure we're not losing that larger voice from the advisory group. Again, during these meetings, the advisory group members are really listening to the recommendation group discussions. But the advisory group and recommendations group are both voting after those measure discussions have ceased. But the recommendations group is really going to be discussing the issues. And so this non-patient representative co-chair will be asked to ensure that we are we have addressed some of the concerns or some of the major issues that have been identified from the advisory group, so that we don't lose that. So that's being considered and discussed by the recommendations group, which is really just a smaller subset of the larger group. So just drawing attention to those two co-chairs, and we will have prep calls. We actually are scheduling those prep calls now with our co-chairs, and we will be also introducing those individuals during those endorsement meetings, especially as we go through roll call. So again, thank you very much for this engagement. Let's go to the next slide. So now we're going to go through actually how the measures will be evaluated. Okay, and these committee independent reviews, like I mentioned at the beginning of the call, that are going on right now will be aggregated. And we are aggregating those to determine whether or not there's consensus amongst those reviews, both either consensus of met, like a domain has been met, or a domain has not been met, et cetera. And also looking to see what the rationale was. Why did somebody think it was met? Maybe they didn't find any issues or concerns with that domain, but then maybe someone else or a group of individuals also found that maybe there was not met and there was some concerns that they had there. So we'll be using that to also then have some discussions around those non-consensus measures and going through the measure. We start with the non-consensus measures, and this is non-consensus on any of those domains, right? So it could be for the importance domain, it could be for the scientific acceptability or feasibility domain. So it's non-consensus on any of those, and we're focusing our conversations on those aspects of the measure. So we start with the non-consensus, and then we go into the consensus measures after we review and discuss the non-consensus measures. So what you're seeing here on the slide is the review of the non-consensus measures. You see the arrow there on the far left kind of is going down the steps of review, and it kind of will proceed to the next slide when we get to it. But the first step will just be to introduce the measure and introduce the areas of that measure where consensus was not achieved or was lacking. So this is Patel staff doing this, right? So Patel staff will be teeing up the measure, will present that domain or domains in which consensus is lacking, and really drawing attention to a summary of the strengths that were identified, as well as some of the limitations or concerns that were identified from the reviews. So it's just a summary of that. In addition, we also will be providing a summary of the public comments that were received prior to the endorsement meeting. So we have public comments that we have for some of these measures. We also will be having comments during the meeting itself. So after we do a summary of the comments that were received prior to the meeting, we go into step 2. We then just open the floor for any additional public comments with respect to measures under review. And you can see it says Patel staff and co-chairs. So this is where the co-chairs will help potentially facilitate this with us, especially if some comments were missed from the patient community, for example. We're looking to collaborate with our co-chairs on this step. So there are some parameters here for any individual who is from the public who wishes to raise a comment. We've just asked that you try to keep your comments into no more than 2 minutes. We really just want to ensure that we have time to get into the measure discussion. So if any member of the public wishes to have a comment during the meeting, please restrict it to 2 minutes or less. Also, the committee is not responsible for responding to comments that happen during the meeting. So during this step, if members of the public have a comment, the committee is not responsible to address or respond to that. Really, you're taking that comment into consideration. That comment may be supportive of the measure, that comment may be non-supportive, or may actually ask for some suggestions or changes to the measure, et cetera. Could be anything. So you're really just thanking that commenter and then taking that into consideration through the remainder of the discussions. So after we get through that, we go to step 3. So this is a 3 to 5 minute high-level overview of the measure. So I know that Patel introduced the measure, but we really are introducing the measure, any issues or areas where there's non-consensus about the measure, as well as a summation of comments. The developer or steward is then provided a 3 to 5 minute overview time. And so the presenters, whoever is doing this, we kindly ask that you really limit that to 5 minutes. Just because we will unfortunately have to cut you off if you are more than 5 minutes, again, because we have to sort of keep the conversation moving. In addition, please do not use any slides or screen share any additional materials. We do a lot of vetting to lead up to these presentations during these meetings. So we do ask to refrain from screen sharing any slides or materials during your overview. Also, you may want to address any initial responses to committee member concerns that you may have seen through those independent reviews. Again, all of those independent reviews, they come in real time, and there are on the websites now as committee members are submitting those independent reviews. So you may want to provide some initial responses to some of those concerns, or even some of the public comments that were received as well. We will be getting into some of those discussions. So if you don't cover it all in your 5 minutes, we will get into some of that through the rest of the steps. So going to the next slide, we'll continue on with these evaluation steps. So after we do that 3 to 5 minute overview from the developer or steward, we then will do just a round robin of the recommendations group. Again, the advisor group here is listening to these discussions, listening to developer responses. All right, so you're listening in listen mode. But the recommendations group, now we're going to go round robin to where you can ask any clarifying questions. So as you were reviewing this measure, maybe something wasn't very clear, maybe something that you needed some clarification on in order for you to really have confidence in your rating. This is an opportunity to ask that of the developer, or you may even just include it in your independent review, right? But you can ask it now, and we'll just do a round robin around the table. And if you don't have any questions, or if a question was asked that you were going to ask, you can just you can state that, and we'll go to the next individual. Here's where our co-chairs will also ensure that the patient voice, any questions that came through, either through the independent reviews, or even making sure that the patients on the recommendations group actually are voicing up and communicating any questions they have, are considered. And then, of course, for the non-patient co-chair, this is an individual that is ensuring that the advisor group voice is also considered, as well as those questions. So after all those questions have been collected, we'll go to the developer or steward for any response to those questions. And we will try to keep this conversation moving. So again, any responses and discussion that happen, we will try to keep it focused and concise in order to continue on with the discussions. So moving to step 5, we then start getting into the discussion of those elements in which consensus was lacking. Right, so this is a facilitated discussion. So there'll be a discussion of the strengths around that domain that where where there was consensus that was lacking, as well as any of the limitations or concerns that came through, and really getting some feedback from the recommendations group on how they feel about those strengths, or how they think about if the limitations outweigh those strengths, and see if there's areas where there could be some consensus or a path forward. So that we will determine that to see if there's maybe any conditions that might want to be placed on the measure for the developer to consider, as well as ensuring that those conditions are actually feasible, right? And so we have some examples of what those conditions could be. We'll touch on here in a little bit. And then the developer may respond to some questions from the committee during this discussion, right? To again, help to determine whether or not any concerns or limitations have been addressed in order to change the rating, or if there's any conditions that may need to have some developer input on. Lastly, subject matter experts. We mentioned that if there are subject matter experts that are involved in a particular project for the evaluation of measure, they are non-voting members. There's no presentation we're asking of subject matter experts. Really, we'll provide instruction a week or so prior to the meeting, really just to have availability for them to attend during that measure evaluation segment of the meeting, and then to be available to answer any questions about the subject matter related to the measure. That could be something that is clinical. It could be something that is a little bit more methods heavy, just depending on the actual topic of the measure and what we may need. And the reason why is because maybe that aspect or that individual subject matter expertise is not on the committee. So these are non-voting members, like I mentioned previously, and they will be called upon as questions do arise to see if there's any additional expertise for those discussions needed. Next slide, please. So after we go through discussing those areas of non-consensus, there will be some final responses maybe developers may want to provide, especially for thinking about conditions that would be placed on the measure. So after that discussion, developers are given one last opportunity to respond to any of the committee's discussion. This could be any final questions that were asked before we move to an endorsement vote. So again, we please try to keep your responses brief, referring to information that is in the measure submission as appropriate, and refrain from using, again, any slides or screen sharing any materials due to the vetting procedures that we go through in advance of these meetings. Lastly, we'll then go to a committee vote. So if there are any conditions or recommendations that were summarized and agreed upon, we'll summarize those prior to voting. And voting again for endorsement or any sort of consensus is really determined by 75% or more. So of those voting, which again is the recommendations group and advisory group members, of those voting, 75% or more have to land on the same outcome to have consensus. That outcome could be endorsed, it could be not endorsed or endorsement removed, for example. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please, and we'll give an example of how this could look. Now, this won't be all typed out for every single measure, but this will really be verbally summarized. When you go to vote, you will have a voting link for all our committee members. You will have a personalized voting link sent to you the morning of the meeting. It is called Voteer, V-O-T-E-E-R. So if you have an email that comes through that has Voteer on it, this is the personalized voting link that you will use for all of your voting that day for the measures. All you need to do is open it up on your browser, and then just as voting is opened for a measure, that browser will change to where you will have the question of endorsement for that measure. So I said we will summarize any conditions or anything that's been placed on the measure. So as an example, here's an example that of what this potentially could look like. So some committee members raised concern that the measure testing occurred only in 2 or 3 US states and recommended to see additional testing across a larger, more generalizable population. So to endorse the measure means that the committee agrees that the evidence provided supported the measure fully substantiates the measure claims, right? There was no issues or concerns, everything is good. No major concern that there needs to be additional testing. So members of the committee could vote just to endorse just because of that. But some members may have raised that concern around the more generalizable population and seeing more testing. So that's one of the conditions. And again, the condition here, we would also want to confirm this is something the developer could feasibly do. So means that the endorsed with the conditions then would be means that the committee agrees that the evidence provided to support the measure doesn't fully substantiate the measure claims because the testing was in 2 or 3 states. And so therefore the votes to endorse this measure have a condition that additional testing would like to be seen in a more generalizable population during the next maintenance review. And under this new process, the next full measure maintenance review is every 5 years, unless specifications have changed, and we would definitely do an update request of developers at 3 years. So there's a little bit more time that developers can have to address some of these concerns, unless this is such a high concern that it needs to come back earlier, before the 5 years, like in 3 years, for example. And then lastly, to not endorse or endorsement removed means the committee does not think that the evidence provided substantiates any of the claims, especially for scientific acceptability because of this testing example, due to those limited testing in a few states. So you may feel that just that testing alone was not enough, and so you want to not endorse, or endorsement will be removed. So we'll summarize that, working with our team and co-chairs as we go into the votes, so that we're clear on endorse means everything looks good, or there's a condition here that needs to be considered, or even that condition being there's just you may feel that there's not enough information to really feel confident to endorse the measure. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So that's how the proceedings will go for the non-consensus measures. Now, for the consensus measures, so again, these are those measures in which the committee had consensus on various different aspects of the measure. We'll first have an introduction of the measure in which consensus. So this in the case would be instead of consensus with lacking, but we have consensus. There's a presentation of that rubric, as well as the committee independent assessments and a summary of the committee's independent review. So noting the strengths and limitations, right? And we do a summation of any public comments as well received for that measure. And then we also, again, open the floor for any additional comments for that measure as well. So same sort of parameters here. Commenters are kindly asked to keep their comments to 2 minutes or less. And then we also will, the committee is not responsible for responding directly to those comments. Again, this is just hearing those comments during the meeting in consideration prior to vote. Now, for those measures in which consensus to endorse, right? There's met, there's or met and not met but addressable areas. There's no not met seen. We want to confirm that the measure strengths really outweigh those any limitations identified. We also want to confirm if any conditions of endorsement should be placed. Again, if there's a not met but addressable, means that that is still achievable, but it's not fully met. So we want to identify if there's any potential conditions here. And then, of course, the co-chairs, as mentioned previously, will ensure that we're not missing the patient community voice, as well as any advisor group member issues as well. So we want to draw attention to that. Going to the next slide, if it's a measure in which consensus is not to endorse, right? There's not mets here, and there's consensus around that, leading to where it potentially could not be endorsed. We want to confirm that the limitations outweigh the strengths identified. Right, and so we want to confirm those, as well as if there's any recommendations for the developer to improve any limitations. And we also want to ensure that we're not missing the patient community voice, as well as the advisory group members from the support with our co-chairs. And then after those discussions, we do want to allow the developer to have an opportunity to respond to any of that discussion or concerns, especially for some potential recommendations being placed on the measure. So after that, we will then move to a committee vote, and same sort of situation. Any conditions or recommendations will be summarized prior to voting, and then of course, the consensus is determined at 75% or more. So let's go to the next slide. As far as the conditions go, here are some sort of examples here, and really. For example, I mentioned this expanded testing. So that's sort of one of these types of testing conditions that could be placed. So you have, conducting and providing additional testing across a larger population, or maybe at different accountable entity levels, or even different levels of analysis. Now, keeping in mind that if the measure is not intended to be at a different level. There may be no need for that, or this measure is under contract for development, which there was no initial need to develop any additional measures. These are the types of things we'll have to keep in mind and also understand from the developer in order to see if that condition is something that wants to be placed on the measure. Another is expanding the measure use beyond just quality improvement. So a lot of times we see measures come through and maybe they're not used, or maybe initially they're sort of used for internal quality improvement within a health system or somewhere else. Is there an opportunity to expand that and actually use that in an accountability application, whether it be maybe a CMS program or something else? So there may be some interest from committee members to expand that use because it is a valuable measure. Maybe it's a high priority gap that they want to see get closed. So is there an opportunity to expand that use? And again, there may be interest from the developer and us obviously putting this as a potential condition. Now, there are some sort of non-negotiables with some of these measures, reviews that we can't really put a condition around. Some of these are like if there's a lack of a clear business case, right? There's that the existence of this measure, it really doesn't improve whatever it is that the developer is claiming it will improve, right? Some sort of outcome or patient-reported outcome, et cetera. There's really not strong confidence you have that there's a strong big business case here because maybe there's no gap either. And so there's that really is a non-negotiable. We also poor feasibility for the measure to be implemented, inappropriate methodologies with testing or even the specifications being very unclear or insufficient. And if the measure has an endorsement with conditions designation and it's evaluated at maintenance at 5 years, this could also be a non-negotiable if that has not been addressed at all. Now, it doesn't mean it's meaning not being addressed at all, meaning like if you have a rationale as why it's not addressed, that will be considered by the committee, right? Let's go to the next slide. So there are 4 options to consider here, and depending on if the measure is a new measure or a currently endorsed measure that's coming back for maintenance, you'll have 3 options. So let's go through this. So endorsed, it's a 75% or greater consensus or agreement on any one of these on the endorsed category. So for those, a recommendation group and advisory group members, the combined count, if 75% of those members say endorsed, the measure will be endorsed. All right, if 75% or greater say endorsed with the conditions, and we articulate what those conditions are, that would be the decision outcome for that measure. So the measure is endorsed, and that condition place, whether it be expanded testing, right, for example, would be the condition, and we wanted to see that the next time the maintenance is reviewed, like say at 5 years. Unless this is a high priority condition that want to see the measure come back sooner, maybe at 3 years. Then there's not endorsed. This is only for new measures, right? So I mentioned depending on a new or maintenance, you have 3 options. So for new measures, since it's not endorsed, you're not removing endorsement. So you're just saying it's not endorsed, right? And then endorsement removed would be for maintenance measures only because it's already endorsed, and we would remove those maintenance, remove endorsement from the measure. Again, it's 75% or greater of committee members voting to determine consensus on these decision outcomes. Next slide, please. And just so a reminder, the PQM rubric, and I think there had been some questions about this. So this rubric is on our PQM website, and this rubric is what you're using to evaluate the measures. Each one of these gets a rating of met, not met but addressable, or not met. And there are criteria to help you establish whether or not it's met or not met but addressable or not met within the rubric. So each domain importance under it will have those criteria for met, not met but addressable. And you can take a look at that. In addition, there's also a measure evaluation worksheet that we've provided also on the PQM website to where if you'd like to go through some questions that are asked of you when you're reviewing measures to help maybe guide you to what your decision would be, that is also a helpful resource if you'd like to use that as well. For their committee members, just as please be sure that when you're entering in your rating, that you're also entering in something into the text field online again, to explain the rationale of why you want it to be met. Maybe you found no concerns, or if you found a concern that's rating is not met, please detail that as much as you can. Again, we use that for the basis of discussion and facilitation during these meetings. So you must do all of that for every domain. So if for committee members specifically, if you miss a domain or you do not enter in a text field, it will not save and you'll have to enter it in again. So we are requiring that you provide a response in the text field so that we, again, can use that as a basis of discussion and facilitation during these meetings. Okay. The equity domain is an optional domain. So as you're looking at the measure evaluations, if the developer did not address this domain, it is optional at this point. We are putting that domain out there to try to see what we can get back from developers and stewards around how they think their measures can address equity or improve disparities, or excuse me, reduce disparities, really improve equity. So it's an optional domain. So this is something that it will not make or break an endorsement decision. We are really looking for information here around how measures can improve equity. And then ultimately, in the future, this could change into a required domain and also be factored into the endorsement. But it's there now as optional. So please keep that in mind. So you may see not mets, especially from our staff preliminary assessments, which are posted at the bottom of those measure pages. You may see not mets here, but that's because maybe the developer didn't address it. But that's okay. Again, it's optional. So that's not a basis for whether or not a measure should have endorsement removed or not endorsed, at least for this cycle, until this becomes something that is more firm within the rubric. Okay, and let's go to the next slide. So here again is how this decision outcome will look. So this table here just is showing where 75% or more of those votes come in and how that will then determine the decision outcome. So as we mentioned, if 75% or more of the recommendations group plus advisor group members vote endorse, the measure is endorsed, right? If 75% or more are spread out between both of those, so endorsed with conditions and endorsed have 75% or more of those votes, the option here would be B. We'll explore those conditions and actually place those conditions on the measure, so it would be endorsed with conditions. It's because there's no consensus here whether the condition should apply or not, but there is consensus that measure should be endorsed. So we'll apply the endorsed with conditions category if there's no consensus across those two, A and B. Now to not endorse, it's either 75% or more saying that we to not endorse a measure or to remove endorsement if it's a maintenance measure. And then of course, if there's no consensus at all. So after going through those discussions, discussing the areas of concern or limitations of the measure, and also the strengths and benefits of the measure, there's still no consensus reached by the committee, the recommendations group and advisor group. That means the measure is not endorsed. Right, that's an important finding. As Brenna had mentioned earlier, there's a lot of information here, even just knowing that the measure is not, there's no consensus here from this larger committee for the community to take into consideration as well as developers. So if we do not reach consensus, then the measure is not endorsed. Okay, next slide, please. So I'll also just mention some next steps before we get into some of the questions here as well. So during the meeting, we also present this same information as well as the next steps, and just so that you know as well what happens after these meetings. So if we go to the next slide. So after these meetings, there will be a meeting summary that's produced. And that meeting summary will be posted, which kicks off our appeals period. So that meeting summary will capture the discussion, just a summary of the discussion, as well as those endorsement decisions and rationales for those. And if there is a condition for endorsement placed, there will be that condition also listed in discussion around that. So those meeting summaries will be posted, which kicks off our appeals period, and you can see when that is supposed to be for fall 2023. That's February 26th through March 18th. The appeals committee, again, that's our co-chairs consisting of all 5 committees. So all of the co-chairs from across all 5 committees form the appeals committee. If there is an appeal received, we will convene the appeals committee, which will be a standing meeting on March 27th. So that meeting is a standing meeting. We will convene the appeals committee to evaluate the appeal or the appeals if we have more than one, and then render a decision. That decision could overturn the decision from the committee. So keeping that in mind as well. And unlike the prior process, the prior endorsement and maintenance process, or the prior CDE process, an appeal can be received on any decision, whether it is to endorse it or to not endorse it. The prior CDE process only measures that were endorsed were eligible for an appeal. But please go through the E&M guidebook to review the eligibility for appeals, especially if the measure is endorsed. It has certain eligibility criteria for an appeal. If it's not endorsed, there's also eligibility criteria there. So when we say an eligible appeal, any member of the public that maybe just doesn't like the measure and just submits that as their appeal, that is not eligible for us to convene the appeals committee to evaluate that measure. There needs to be more substance under that based on the criteria that are listed within the E&M guidebook. So please draw attention to that. Again, if it's not eligible, we will not convene the appeals committee. Lastly, to conclude the cycle at the end of the appeals period, there is a technical report that will be posted for each project. And this is, again, at the conclusion of the 6-month process and the appeals period. It will have this technical report, which will provide a summary of all of this that happened in the prior 6 months. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so thank you all for being patient and also submitting some of your questions. I know that we see some of these come through. So if you do have a question and you didn't see this earlier, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom platform that you can use to submit your question, and we can definitely go through those. And we'll see what we can get to today with the remaining time that we have. So I think, Quinn, do you want to see what kind of questions we have?
Sure, Matt. So we're going to start, we've had a number of questions come through. So we're going to start with some questions around the review process for committee members. The first question, are public comments reviewed by staff before the staff recommendations are written?
So, so public comments, no. So what we do review those, but the evaluation of those staff assessments is using the PQM rubric. We do review those public comments, and we do summarize those public comments, and they are posted on the web pages. And we do provide we develop our staff preliminary assessments in parallel to the public comment period. But we do summarize those, and we will be summarizing those during the meeting as well, like I mentioned previously.
All right, thank you. The next question is around reviewing, and given the large amount potentially of content for the committee members, should reviewers be aiming for brevity in their rationale?
That's a great question. It's a great question. And as Brendan mentioned, and very much I want to echo that, we recognize this could be a first for a lot of individuals, especially if you've done evaluation of measures in the past. This is a new type of approach and process, and how information is presented is also a little different. So we do want to, first of all, thank the patience of our reviewers and also our developers and stewards as we start to roll this process out and seek areas of improvement. But we recognize that brevity is great, and being as succinct as possible is helpful, especially we're thinking about aggregating these types of findings. But we just ask to be as clear as you can about any strength that you found, and thus why you don't think there's any issue, or any limitation you identified that causes you concern, and maybe you're wanting to rate that domain of the measure as not met, for example. If you think it's not met but addressable, what is it that needs to be addressed in order for you to have a met decision? If you could be as specific and succinct as possible, that would be ideal. And I think if you're also identifying those concerns, if there's any additional detail that you can provide, that would also be helpful. Again, we want to be able to use those as discussion points during the meeting to identify, like, well, a good number of individuals drew concern with this issue, and here's why. Let's provide a little bit more detail as a result. So yes, brevity, succinct, and being clear as possible. But if you do have some limitations that you've identified, if you do see that there's something that can be done to help change your decision, try to be as clear as possible with that in specific.
Thank you, Matt. So another topic is around our process in the meetings. I think we covered that, but there's a couple of questions from measure developers. So the first one is, will measure developers receive the evaluation scores and any corresponding comments prior to the endorsement meeting?
Yeah, great question as well. So I mentioned we will be aggregating these ratings and try to identify areas of consensus, non-consensus. We will be producing those about towards a week or so before these meetings. But you are also able to look at that right now. So committee members have until the 22nd to enter in their committee independent reviews. So after that date, we won't be having any more of these independent reviews coming through. So you can start to go in and actually look at those ratings and start to see where there's where there are some of these concerns that are coming through from committee members or questions that come through. And so we will be doing an aggregation of those and then also be providing those back out as well towards the end of that time after January 22nd.
Thank you, Matt. And then additionally, when can measure stewards expect to receive the E&M agendas to know when their measures will be discussed?
Yeah, and thank you for your patience, by the way, stewards and developers, as well as our committee members. So we have been trying to identify and ensure which measures are definitely coming through the process. So for example, we've had a couple measures have already been withdrawn. So we really try to work to get these agendas out as soon as we can. We are targeting next week to get these agendas out so that you know when your measures will be discussed. So just if you could wait till next week, that would be great. But thank you very much for that question. We'll get the agendas out. And then, of course, the slides and things will come later after we've done some aggregating of the results.
Thank you. So this question is about the advisory group. Are advisory group members prohibited from participating in this discussion? And are they in listening mode only with the expectation that the non-patient representative co-chair advocate will advocate on their behalf?
Great question as well. Yeah, we do want to reserve the discussions for the recommendations group. Thus, if you're an advisory group member and you have any particular input or concern you'd like to voice, please ensure to include that into your committee independent reviews so that we can see if there's a lot of that similarity coming across from other reviewers as well. And we won't be opening up the call for advisory group members to discuss similar to what the recommendations group is doing. Again, this is where we're looking at the advisory group to be listening to those discussions and hearing any of those concerns being presented and then considered. And then also with the developer responses to that and then weighing that into your final vote. But there won't be that discussion that's happening with the advisory group. You are asked to be in listen-only mode. And I'll say that, through this process, there's always opportunity for improvement. And so we will be doing feedback surveys after this first cycle. And if there are things that you think could be improved or as well as what could change, we definitely are very open to that. This includes maybe having some sort of a listening session with advisory groups in advance of these meetings, things like that we've already heard some feedback around. So, but for these meetings coming up, advisory group members will be listening and listen only mode, as well as the recommendations group will be discussing the issues. As far as the patient voice, this is where us as Patel staff will be ensuring that we're trying to bring that forward and working with our patient co-chair, our patient representative co-chair, to ensure that that's not lost as well.
All right, thank you, Matt. And I know we talked a little bit about voting, so that we had a question around, is the voting based on the advisory group? And if so, what's the threshold? Is it the same 75% for the recommendation group?
Another great question. So So the entire committee, which consists of recommendations group and advisor group, that's where the endorsement decision and voting occurs. So we're not voting with the advisor group separately and the recommendations group separately. It's really the entire group. And then we're basing that 75% on that entire group vote. So again, after those discussions of the measures and then the summary of those issues that were discussed, we open up the vote. And when you're voting as an advisor group member and a recommendations group member, you'll have that on your screen. And when the vote is open for that measure, the web page will show the question and the measure you're voting on, and then the options either to endorse with conditions, or not endorse and remove. And then again, collectively, the 75% consensus is based on that collective votes of advisor group and recommendations group.
All right, thank you. Next, we'll move to a couple of questions around conflict of interest and recusal. If I can say that correctly. The first one, can you talk about the conditions of recusal?
Sure. So yes. So I was trying to think what the question was really getting at, but I'll just there in the E&M guidebook, there are a list of things that we will look at or ask for members to disclose. These are things of whether there's been any involvement of the committee member in the development of that measure. So this could mean that a committee member participated on a technical expert panel or a patient focus group, or something that you help to advise or provide your opinions about a measure of the measure being developed. And that measure is now coming through that committee you're participating on. So if you've been involved in any of the development, we want to know that. If you have also worked as an employee of that developer, or contracted with that developer for the development of the measure, we would also want to know that as well. So there are those types of things we want to see on these measure disclosure of interest forms. Now, as far as recusal goes, if that type of involvement really is significant enough, meaning you did help advise on the measure, you did work for the developer, and also worked with this measure, either as a contractor or what have you, that would result in a recusal. And recusal under this new process means that you just cannot vote. You can discuss, and you can also present your concerns, or also provide your input based on discussions that happened during the development of the measure or during your participation on a TEP for the measure. You can definitely present those, but when we go to vote, you will just be recused from the voting. So that means you will just not, you won't be voting for that measure. And we will identify that, as Brendan mentioned, during the roll call and disclosures of interest. So as we go through roll call, we will call your name. You will be asked to present your name and your affiliation. And then if you've identified anything within your disclosure of interest forms that you would like to disclose. We also will be looking at those disclosures of interest forms. We will be reaching out to committee members in advance of the meetings to let them know if this results in a recusal or not, and we'll confirm that publicly during the meetings. So again, the recusal does not mean that you cannot participate in the discussions or evaluation, the evaluation discussions of the measure. You just will not be voting. You are recused from voting. And again, this is laid out in the E&M guidebook as well under the conflict of interest.
Thank you, Matt. And I think this additional question, you maybe answered it, but there was specifically about, do they have to disclose if they own any individual stock?
Yeah, there is a section in the guidebook that mentions this, especially if if this measure being endorsed or not endorsed really significantly benefits that organization you may have stock in. We'd like to know that. Just to be transparent, these disclosures are really about openness and transparency. All of our work is fully transparent. These discussions, our evaluations, as you can see, your committee independent reviews are also being presented as you submit them onto these measure pages. So really, it's just about being open and transparent so that we understand if you really have this conflict that is significant enough to be recused.
Thank you. We're going to shift back to a measure developer question, Matt.
Okay.
How do measure developers know if they are a recommendation or advisory group, or does it not matter for them from their perspective?
So I guess there's two parts to that. So
Yes.
one, if you're a developer or a steward, yeah, you're not on a recommendations group or advisor group. You are there during the meeting to, again, have an overview. You present an overview of your measure when it's time to do so, and then also answering any questions the committee may have. And this is really the recommendations group through their discussions. So answering any questions that may come up, as well as providing any final sort of comments as well that help the committee for their decision making. You're also there especially if conditions pop up for consideration. You're also there to speak to whether those conditions are feasible or that's not possible kind of situation. Now, if you're a developer on a committee, so sometimes you are a developer who's also a committee member. We randomized who is going to be on recommendations or advisory group, right? This go around. And so there wasn't any sort of specific decision that a developer should be on a recommendation group or advisory group. If you are also a committee member, you're a committee member and have an equal vote and say, unless it's a measure that you are involved in or from a developer or from an organization you're working for is coming through the process. Again, that's the potential conflict and potential recusal that would result from that. But just as a developer or steward, you are there as a developer and steward. You're not a recommendation group member or advisory group member. That's only reserved for committee members. But if you are a developer and also serving on a committee, we randomized committee members to those two groups. And so you would just participate on one of those groups as is. And of course, if a measure comes through that you are involved with, you are able to speak about the measure if you are recused. And keeping that in mind, especially if you're on the recommendations group, you're able to speak to that, but you're just not voting because obviously you're voting on your own measure or a measure that your organization has developed.
All right, thank you. I think we have a few more minutes, Matt, if we want to keep going with some additional questions.
Sure.
And this is around committee members review. Given that some of the committee members may be new and there's a learning curve, if they say for one of their reviews that the criteria was not met in their initial evaluation, but then during the discussion, they realize they misunderstood, is there opportunity for them to change their vote?
Yes, well, yes, and to clarify, the ratings you're putting into your independent reviews of met, not met but addressable, not met, these are there for us to use as a basis of facilitation and discussion. Your vote is going to be during the endorsement meetings, and that's where it's either based on all of those discussions and the review of those areas where there was maybe not consensus on those domains. How do you want to vote on the endorsement of the measure? You either want to endorse it, or maybe there's endorse with conditions, and those conditions are this, or not endorse, endorsement removed. So if you found that maybe in your independent review, you found something was not met, but then the discussions, you change your mind, then to met, or maybe not met but addressable, you can factor that into your final vote. And again, that's the reason and purpose for this type of process is that you may be identifying or rating something during your independent reviews, but through the discussion and the larger collective review, that decision may change for you, and that's perfectly acceptable. And that's the reason for this process. We want to ensure that those voices are considered, and it's okay if you change that viewpoint of the measure based on those discussions before going to vote.
All right, thank you. I think we have two questions around committee member support. The first one being for the rubric, what do they do with it once they've completed it? So
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I'll try. I'm sorry, I'll try to answer as best as I can. Yes, so when you are actually looking at the rubric and you're reviewing the measure, so you would look at the importance domain in the rubric, and as you're reviewing the importance section, you're sort of reviewing that and seeing if things are being addressed based on the rubric. You then assign your rating to that. Right? You assign whether or not it's met, not met but addressable, and then you move to the next. And you can enter that into the system online as you go, but we actually recommend that you sort of write your ratings and your rationale for ratings down on a separate piece of paper. And then just when you're ready to enter that into the system, you log in to the online system. So using your user account, you log in and then you go to the measure and then you go down to the page where the committee independent review is, and then you enter in that information. You would click met or not met, but addressable or whatever, and then copy and paste the rationale you have into the text field. Again, you have to do this for every single domain. You have to have the rating, and then the text field needs to be populated. If you don't do that and you hit save, it will not save. So we just make sure you do it for each domain. I think that might have been answered. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, probably. And I think this kind of segues us into if they have questions about the forms or anything, like who do they need to reach out to receive support? I think in your previous screen, it had some contact information, PQM.
Yeah, let's go to I think it's the next screen here on the thank you slide. You can see it's, yeah, and Kelsey, yeah, there you go. So it's this email address. If you do have questions about the rubric or the form, or if you're having some issues logging into your account, right, you can email pqmsupport@patel.org. So there's been prior educational webinars we've held about how to create your user account. And actually, if you go to the E&M submit a measure, you can actually see a video there about how to actually create a user account. So if you have any issues though, or any questions about the form or the rubric as you're reviewing, pqmsupport@patel.org is the email address you will contact.
All right. I think we have additional questions coming in. Let's see here. We have two around the endorsement conditions or the endpoint. The first one is, does endorsement combined with endorsement with condition need to be above 75%, or is it either individually?
Yeah, so a great question. So yes, if there's a spread of votes between endorsed with conditions and endorsed, but the total amount of that spread is 75% or more of the total committee votes, then we would look to see the endorsed with conditions would be the decision outcome. So the reason is because there's just not consensus on whether it should be fully endorsed with no issues or endorsed with conditions. And so we really want to draw attention that there are committee members that really feel strongly that these conditions should be considered or looked at. And so it will be endorsed with conditions. Again, that is if there's a spread of votes across endorsed with conditions, but it's 75% or more of the total committee votes are consisting of that spread. So that's where the endorsed with conditions would be applied if you see both endorsed and endorsed with conditions spread.
All right, thank you. And then additionally, what does it mean or what are the means by which it is determined that conditions have been met for conditional endorsement?
Yeah, so this is where during the maintenance review, so that typically would be 5 years. So for example, if there was that condition of wanting to see additional testing outside of just 2 or 3 states, we also want to ensure that the developer, first of all, is able to do this. There's resources potentially available for that. There has to be some feasibility from the developer. But at maintenance at 5 years, the expectation then will to revisit those conditions and actually see if that's been addressed. Has there been any additional testing outside of those 2 or 3 states that were tested when it was initially endorsed or the last time it came through endorsement? And if not, we want to see a rationale as to why. Why did that not happen? That would be considered by the committee, right? So the committee would then reconsider whether or not that rationale applies or is sufficient in order to continue to have the measure be endorsed. So there may be some conditions that are not met at all, and so we really do want to encourage developers to consider these conditions the next time there's maintenance endorsement, as the committee will be reviewing that. And really wanting to see if the conditions have been met at all, or if there's a rationale to support why that condition could not be met.
Thank you. And then along those lines, you mentioned, 5-year maintenance. Can you explain the maintenance cycle of a 5-year or annual review at 3 years? That's the first part of the question. And then the second part is, how will measure stewards know when their measure is to be reviewed?
Yes, all good questions. And this, I'm not sure if this might be the last one. I'm not sure. Just looking at our time.
Yeah, we have a few.
So, so the maintenance cycle process, it will be different than what we've normally seen at the prior CDE. So the full measure sort of review is going to be at it's 5 years typically. So as measures come through the process, this 5-year applies for measures that have come through the Patel process already. So if they've come through, then there's a 5-year maintenance cycle assigned to that. So for example, fall 2023, if there's an endorsed measure, that next cycle would come back into be fall 2028 as a full measure. But at 3 years, we are asking developers and stewards to submit sort of a status report to us. And that status report is just to see if there's anything that has changed of the measure. Any specifications have changed that would cause the measure to need to come back through prior to that 5 years. Any other additional changes that are important for us to know and important for the committee to consider that, again, that would cause the measure to come back through prior to that 5 years. So that's at 3. And there is a status report form on our PQM website that developers will submit in order for us to consider whether or not the measure can still move forward for the 5-year or needs to come back earlier. So at 5 years, it's just like your usual maintenance review cycle, right? Everything you have an intent to submit, you have the full measure submission, all of that will be done. But that 3-year touch point of a status report is wanting to see if there's anything that has significantly changed with the measure that we need to bring in earlier than that 5 years. We are working right now on bringing all these measures that have gone through the process already up to speed with that 5-year designation and emailing developers and stewards accordingly to let them know about the 5-year and 3-year timeline. And then once these measures start coming through, this will start changing into the system. So when you go into the measure page, there will be like a measure record there that indicates what cycle it was currently reviewed in, when the next cycle it's going to be reviewed in, and by which committee, if that committee has been identified. So for the measures that have already come through with Patel, so those would be like the fall 2022 measures and even the spring 2023 measures as we get closer to the end of that cycle. Those measure cycles, the maintenance cycles will be updated or already have been updated for those measures, specifically for fall 2022. So if you look at the measure record, you'll see that the next maintenance cycle for those measures will be fall 2027. And so those will, that's how this will work with that maintenance cycle and then the 3-year checkpoint.
Thank you, Matt. That's our final question. We're a little bit out of time.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. Let's again, I know this is the first time for a lot of folks, especially first time with this process. And so we very much appreciate the patience and level of engagement with all of this. If you do have questions as you're going through pqmsupport@patel.org, please go ahead and use that and email us. Again, we will be attempting to post the agendas next week for these meetings so that developers and stewards know which measures are being discussed, as well as any member from the public. So you can kind of see where those measures, what timeframes those measures will be discussed, because again, we have public comment opportunities as we present the measures before we get into the committee discussions. And again, for committee reviewers, if you have any questions as you're going through this process, please feel free to reach out to the pqmsupport@patel.org. If you haven't already, for those who may be new to this or just kind of getting involved in some of the E&M proceedings or PQM proceedings, you can sign up to become a PQM member. This allows you to get email blasts about any activities that are going on for both endorsement and maintenance activities, but also some of the pre-rulemaking measure review work that goes on as well with under PQM. You can do that by going to the PQM website and going to the Get Involved page. The PQM rubric, as well as the PQM measure evaluation worksheet, are also online and available under the Endorsement and Maintenance About tab. If you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see Measure Evaluation, or close to the bottom, you see Measure Evaluation text. That's where you'll find the worksheet as well as the standalone rubric. But again, the rubric is also within the E&M guidebook under Appendix D. Okay. Well, thank you all very much for your time. Greatly appreciate this. We look forward to these meetings coming up at the end of the month and we'll go through these proceedings again during those calls just to refresh everyone about how this will work, and then we'll get into those discussions. I'm looking forward to that. Thank you. With that, we'll say have a good rest of your afternoon and good rest of your week, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the end of the month.